Hello, and welcome to the Dissident Mama podcast. Today we have Dave Benner. Benner speaks and writes on topics related to the U.S. Constitution, founding principles in the early republic. Benner is also the author of Compact of the Republic, the League of States in the Constitution, and the 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine. He writes articles for the 10th Amendment Center, the Mises Institute, Abbeville Institute, and Intellectual Takeout. He also produces historical content at davebenner.com and YouTube. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks for having me, Rebecca. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I'm really excited to just dive into who you are and how did you end up becoming this historical guy who's producing all this great content. So let's just dive into it. I've been meaning to talk to you for a while, and originally when we started connecting, you start running in these really small circles in the world we live in. Everybody else is crazy, and we're over here being this minority of sane people. But anyway, I was shocked to find out that you are from Wisconsin. Oh my gosh! So how did that happen? How did Wisconsin boy, the state with these progressive roots and Lafayette and all that kind of thing, how are you kind of old school real history, maybe even pro Southern? How did this occur?
Good question. I guess I'm not technically from Wisconsin. I'm originally from Tennessee, but indeed I lived most of my life in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and I went to the University of Wisconsin River Falls. I know that you also attended the University of Wisconsin system, so I lived most of my life in the Midwest. I always thought that I wanted to return to the South someday, and truly I find out more and more that I am a son of the South, and I love living here. But I went to school there, got my history education degree, and took an interest in history. And that's really where it took root for the most substantial part of my life.
Were you a history major, or did you discover all this after college?
Yeah, for most of my educational life in college, I had intended to be a history teacher. So that was basically my plan the whole time. It didn't actually turn out that way, although, of course, as you know, that is my top passion, and I still enjoy it today.
So you once told me back in the day when we were becoming Facebook friends, social media friends, that you used to be a Lincolnian, possibly even a Lincolnian cultist. So give us a little, it may be a long story, it could be, but tell us what that conversion process was like. It's not the road easily traveled. So how did it occur?
Yeah, great. I mean, great question. I absolutely was. I considered Lincoln really of the utmost quality in terms of presidents, and really almost deified him to an extent, much like much of the populace still does. I considered myself proudly a nationalist. I actually describe myself that way. I was really into what most people would call neoconservatism today. I very much backed, George W. Bush, his administration, Richard Pearl, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, all that crew that was really pushing, the project for the new American century, if your listeners know what that is, and really kind of the hawkish narrative. And a lot of that ideology traces itself directly back to Lincoln. And really, I thought he couldn't be beaten by any president as far as his role as an overseer over the country. But I actually one time stumbled upon a little old book by Thomas DiLorenzo called The Real Lincoln. I know you are very much aware of him, and maybe your listeners are as well, but that book from the introduction onward completely blew my mind in so many ways. And I still point to that intro done by the immaculate Walter E. Williams as one of the best intros I've ever read in any book whatsoever. I really recommend that everyone picks that up. But Thomas DiLorenzo goes back into all these things that the chief biographers of Lincoln, like David Donald, actually, wrote about, but they never get highlighted in kind of mainstream Lincoln narratives. And a lot of people don't know the extent to which, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He jailed Northern newspaper editors that disagreed with him. He basically perverted the voluntary characteristic of the Union that the founders intended. So it really was a long path to getting to that point. But by kind of the late 2000s, I really, really rigidly resisted that pro-Lincolnian urge that I previously displayed.
That's interesting. My kids and I are currently listening to that on audiobook. I have read large swaths up to this point, but never the whole thing from beginning to end. And my kids are 12 and 13, so I wish I'd known this stuff when I was 12 and 13. And we'll get to Lincoln in a bit, but I'm going to say that I think that your work is very it does a good job, just like Thomas DiLorenzo, of taking these big, big, overwhelming topics and making them accessible to people and cracking the veneer. And that's all it takes for people who are intellectually curious and really care about truth. uh, I would say that's one of the things you do a really good job on. So I think you're right, you're up there with DiLorenzo, man. You're doing a great job. So
Thank you.
how did you, okay, this guy born in Tennessee, raised in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Lincolnian guy, how did you become who you are now, as far as politically, ideologically? So what are you now? And was it that book and something else, or do we need to bridge that gap at all? Well, first of all, I guess define yourself politically. I know people hate labels, but I find them very helpful.
Yeah, I would accept I would accept numerous names, most of which have something of a historical basis. I would characterize myself as a Jeffersonian um, in terms of American political philosophy.
Mhm.
Um, I consider myself philosophically libertarian. I'm actually part of the Libertarian Party. I am especially attracted to a certain faction of the Libertarian Party known as the Mises Caucus. And one of the chief reasons is its emphasis on radical political decentralization, which really is at the heart of most of what I have come to believe. But it was a transition in the mid 2000s. Like I said, I was something of a neoconservative kind of Bush apologist and repeated all sorts of things that I feel embarrassed for today. But it wasn't until I discovered some of the great works of people like Murray Rothbard and Tom Woods and Thomas DiLorenzo that I really started to change my mentality. And it really solidified by the time of Ron Paul's 2008 presidential
Yeah.
run. And I think he is one of the foremost um, political figures of our time as far as abiding by what I consider the political ideal of a person.
It's interesting because my evolution was very long as well, and now people change overnight on a dime. And on one hand, if they come over to our way of thinking, that's great, please do that. But on the other hand, like, I don't know how that happens. So that's interesting. So let's get into a few topics, and then we'll round it out at the end with kind of like big picture stuff. So let's talk about the Harriet Tubman is going to be put on some of the new $20 bills. Andrew Jackson is going to come off. So, what's your take? Why is the Fed bothering with something like this? I mean, what does it say about current woke tyranny, or just the Fed in general? What's your take on all this?
Oh, where to start with this? That's such a big topic. So it's a complicated issue because it determines what you think the purpose of putting people on the currency is. If you think that it's a form of reverence, or if you think it's a form of, making people recognize important figures in history. I don't have a preference toward that, but what I will say is that Jackson absolutely defined a critical period of American history, so much so that he has an era of history named after him. It's the Jacksonian era, and antebellum historians absolutely recognize that, and so much curriculum is based on that because that guy was extremely influential for his time for many reasons, and we could talk more about him.
Yeah.
But Harriet Tubman, I mean, she is a prominent figure in a very small period of American history. Fairly important figure, gets good notoriety. But I think that her legacy is at best as mixed as Jackson's in some ways. And I'm not the biggest fan of Jackson, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. But very few people, bring this up. But Harriet Tubman, albeit heroic in terms of helping slaves to escape their masters and secure freedom, actually helped actively recruit volunteers and resources for John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which really led to, a series of indiscriminate killings that really had no objective other than to try to start a slave revolt, which included violence. So I think that most of the reason that it's happened is because she is part of a new movement of history that takes identity politics and cultural Marxism and puts it to the forefront. And that's not to detract from her. I think she has some redeemable features, but I don't think that her record is spotless. Just like I don't think Jackson's is spotless. So,
Right.
um, like I said, Jackson, ironically, being on the currency, he was a big opponent of the Second National Bank, and eventually was able to undermine it completely by his veto message. Um, but he certainly defined an era much more than Tubman.
And when you say the Second National Bank, tell readers, tell listeners what that means, because a lot of people think that it always existed. What did that
Yeah.
mean? What was he opposing?
Yeah, so like Jefferson and Madison before him, Andrew Jackson opposed central banking, and that's where you give a bank a monopoly on the printing of currency, um, and that is really one of the most controversial subjects from the onset of the Republic.
Hmm.
Alexander Hamilton's first national bank was one of the most contentious political issues of the 1790s. Of course, Alexander Hamilton supporting that, and James Madison, Thomas Jefferson totally condemning it and fighting against it. Well, Hamilton succeeded, but that bank only had a 20-year charter. So, in time, actually, ironically, Madison passed a renewal of the bank, which became known as the Second National Bank. And Jackson essentially thought it was a den of vipers and thieves. There's a classic Jackson quote to that extent, and he thought that central banking was, essentially tyranny. So he eventually, actually via executive power, withdrew all of the bank deposits and put them into what his political opponents called pet banks. And I think there's actually some constitutional issues with that. But heroically, he wrote a veto message vetoing the renewal of that bank for reasons that the Constitution doesn't authorize it. He essentially used the same arguments that Jefferson did back in the 1790s. If you read that Jackson bank veto message, I think it still stands as one of the best remnants of constitutional originalism, despite my other problems with Jackson.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's like you use the word mixed. You, everybody has these mixed histories, and it's what we decide to cover and not cover. And it seems like with the woke people, it's everything wonderful, and you're not allowed to talk about these other things. Where with Jackson or Jefferson, it has to be only what people deem as evil today or whatever, judging them by presentist modern standards. And that's one of the things I love about true history and what the work you do and all the modern historians that I like. They tell excuse me, the whole story, and it's so fascinating and so interesting and not boring in the least. And that's one thing that I love tapping into history because it's almost like a soap opera. I say this as a woman that it's so much more interesting than what we've been told. And I think Jackson is just such a great example of that. I mean, people just seem so kind of almost enigmatic that they do these wonderful things that we still, liberty lovers find virtuous, but then they do other things too. And trying to understand that, I think helps us understand about our current state. But, and speaking of current state, it seems like a lot of people think we've always had a Federal Reserve, always had a national bank, these kinds of things. And even just something like that, if you plant a seed into somebody and they'll just say, I had no idea that was not always the case. And I find this all the time with really smart people I hang out with. They just don't know. And once you plant a seed, they want to know more. They're like sponges. And in fact, last weekend I had two people, a friend, a Facebook friend in Texas, and a local homeschool mom I know, and say that they both contacted me and said, what do I need to know about Lincoln? I know he's a bad guy, but I don't know where to start. So it's kind of cool. I'm like the medium for people to say, read The Real Lincoln by Thomas DiLorenzo. Start there. But tell us a little bit more about about Jackson. You had done a review on Brad Birzer's 2018 book in defense of Jackson. Maybe you won't go that whole way, but you said something awesome at the end of your review. Rather than defend or criticize Jackson's views and responses to every conceivable political subject, Birzer's work instead portrays Jackson as a man who was frank, honest, and consistent, for better or worse. Rather than justify his deeds in defense of Jackson, instead depicts Jackson in the context of his own world. I mean, that's so important to history, and we just don't have that now. Is there anything else you know about Jackson that you want to tell listeners, and anything else you want to really parse out? Because I just think the way you worded that is so important.
Well, thank you. Absolutely. I totally agree that Jackson is the most enigmatic figure in American history because I find so much that I love about him, and then other times I find so much to hold disdain for. And I live about 15 miles away from his manor. It's in a place called Hermitage, which is just to the east of Nashville, and really recommend people go there. But yeah, Jackson was such an interesting figure. So what I'll give him credit for, I'll give him credit for two things, and then I'll slam him for two things. How's that? So
Fair.
the two things I'll give him credit for is he is the first and only president to be the driver for the total elimination of the federal debt. So during his administration, he completely destroyed the debt with the help of Congress, of course, but that feat's never been accomplished before. And he truly, lived by the mantra that government should not be outspending its means. So I think that's really admirable, actually, about Jackson. The other thing is that
Hold your point 1 second. My dog is barking. You're on to point 2. Don't forget.
okay. And secondly, what I said before, the bank veto messaging or the bank veto message, he said essentially the same thing as Thomas Jefferson did. We don't have the constitutional impetus for and the necessity for a national bank. And we just take that for granted today. Like you alluded to before, the Federal Reserve, it's been here since 1913. A lot of people think that that's forever existed, and it's because of the Fed that the dollar has lost so much of its value. It's the dollar's only worth about 3% of what it was originally in 1913 when the Fed just got started. So we have artificial manipulation of the interest rates, which these men thought was a cruel and tyrannical prospect. And Jackson was the figure in American history that was able to end it, at least for quite a long time, about 70, 80 years. So that is definitely, again, admirable. The two things that I will challenge Jackson on is his role in what's called the nullification crisis and what's called the force bill. So what happened there was the 1828 and 1832 tariffs. These were a set of tax policies passed by the federal government, especially at the behest of what were called the American Whigs, followers of Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, that pushed what was called the American system, which called for protective tariffs. Now, what that meant was taxes on foreign goods. And by placing taxes on foreign goods, you essentially forced the buying patterns of individuals to seek products that were either subpar or more money. And that disproportionately affected the South. And when South Carolina, raised ire about this, essentially, they had decided to arrange for a Republican elected Congress to consider whether those taxes were unconstitutional. They did so and eventually determined that they weren't. Therefore, they were going to nullify these federal tariffs. And what that meant was South Carolinians would prevent the imposition of these tariffs and use state resources actually to push back against them. Prominent South Carolinian John C. Calhoun, who was once Andrew Jackson's vice president, actually resigned partially because of these developments and eventually wrote a very influential tract called The Exposition and Protest. It was to explain South Carolina's reasoning for having done this. Well, whether or not you think that the federal tariffs were or were not constitutional, I actually think they were constitutional, although I'm not for protective tariff policy. Jackson decided to with his political allies in Congress, have drafted legislation that called for the outright invasion of South Carolina to pay for the taxes. Now, the Constitution gives the president the power to execute the laws of the Union, and it gives Congress the power to summon the militia. But this is a controversial subject because in Article 4 of the Constitution, there is prose that makes it seem like it needs to be the governor of the state or the legislature if the government, or the legislature of a state or the governor if the legislature cannot meet, that should order the assistance of the federal government. So this is a controversial topic. What ended up happening is forces from South Carolina negotiated a lower rate, but Jackson was willing to shed blood over this. And it was just a very interesting time in U.S. history. And I think one of the reasons that sheds light on the benefits of nullification as a concept, because rather than lead to bloodshed, South Carolina's resistance caused for a negotiated rate that both sides could accept, and South Carolina would remain in the Union. Although in the state, there was lots of voices calling for outright secession and even condemning John Calhoun for not being extreme enough on his position on it.
Wow.
So sorry, that was very long-winded, but
No.
I don't like Jackson's position on that in that realm, and I talk about that quite a bit in my book.
Yeah, and speaking of books, which one are you talking in that one about? Compact of the Republic?
That's right. So Compact of the Republic, the League of States, and the Constitution. I have a section where I talk about kind of the Jeffersonian tradition. And what I mean by that is I'm covering ways in which the principles of 98 or nullification was used to secure liberty in localities when the federal government had overstepped its authority.
And would you define nullification as some, would this be a good definition? The federal government wants you to do something. We're not going to do it here. Come and enforce it, kind of that kind of thing. Is that kind of the easy definition for nullification?
That is the easy definition. I mean, there's certain corollaries to it, I think, and certain axioms that go along with it. But generally, the idea is that a local government, and by virtue of the fact that the states actually created the federal government, so the precept behind the whole idea is the fact that the creature cannot control the creator. Since the states created the federal government, they should be the arbiters of last resort when the federal government has violated the confines of its own powers. So, based on that precept, indeed, that is the state standing up and saying, no, we won't accept the implementation and execution of this policy because it's unconstitutional.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people understand that concept today, but don't know it's something called nullification, don't know it's something that's historical. They could say, oh, well, they're not going to come take my high capacity magazines. I don't care what the federal government says. I'm not going to take the vaccine, whatever it happens to be. And I'm like, that's nullification. Like if we can get the people, in Raleigh or wherever you live to not do that, this is good. Sheriffs are important, those types of things. Well, what about on the flip side of that? Well, counties were a creation of states, right? Is this correct?
Yeah, that is correct, and that's a really important idea because unlike the relationship that states have to the federal government, counties of states have a different relationship to the state because indeed the states set up the counties for the administrative purposes of the state. In most cases, there could be cases where that's not true, but overwhelmingly that is true.
So, what would you say if a county wanted to not do what the governor said? Would Is there a case to be made for that? Kind of like, oh, the ship has sailed, nobody's following the Constitution anymore anyway, so why the heck not? I mean, what would you say personally?
Again, that's such a good question. So I don't think there's as nearly as good of a constitutional case for it because I don't know of any state constitutions that allow that to be permissible. But under Lockean precepts of self-determination, any government that oversteps its authority according to a people's judgment could be altered and abolished by those people. So I think I really back the case for radical political decentralization down to the county, community, and even town block area. Now, will that play out that way? Not necessarily, but that's not really germane to the point. I do think that there's a Lockean Jeffersonian justification for that mentality where government should be closer to where the individual is. And if individuals in a community think that the government isn't serving their needs anymore, it could be altered and abolished. That's what the founders thought. Yeah. That's what those who signed the Declaration of Independence thought.
Right. So more a natural rights thing that could, constitution, smonstitution. It has to do with people's liberties and abolishing the chains, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. But again, I would concede that there isn't is a constitutional justification for that in the same way that I
Yeah.
think states can secede from the federal government.
What else do you want to tell us about Compact of the Republic? Elevator pitch. Why should people get this book? What else is it going to elucidate for maybe newbies that know basic history, but you want to just, set them on fire with all this good, deep stuff?
Sure, absolutely. So, Compact of the Republic, here's my elevator speech. So, this is if the Constitution had a biography, this is its biography. This shows how the Constitution came to be and why it's really exceptional in terms of governmental frameworks throughout the world. Because instead of a very powerful central government, like let's say France, where districts were set up for the administrative convenience of the center, the federal government was set up by the states. The states, under a compact, which is essentially a contract amongst sovereign parties, created this constitution, and as a byproduct, the government in which is now called the federal government. That's such a unique precept in human history because in almost every other example, either a usurpation or a revolution has led to the ascension of a very centrally oriented government. And the other thing that I show in the book is the fact that liberty can only survive as long as localities push back against the either unjust, immoral, or unconstitutional edicts or policies of the central government. So I really want to make the case that the founders did not create this as so much of an experiment to the extent that is often portrayed. They look back into history, especially in 13th century, 17th century British history, to see examples that led them to believe that this was necessary.
Yeah, I like the whole localities pushback thing. Again, nothing could be more apropos for what we're living in today and what, I think is uh, just one of the ways we can move forward. I don't think there's any single thing that liberty minded people can do, but that is where it's at. And we'll get into that in a bit because I always ask people, so what should we be doing now? So beware, that's going to be one of your questions. All right, what about your book, The 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine? What is the 14th Amendment and what is incorporation doctrine? Please tell listeners.
Okay, yeah, the 14th Amendment has many different facets to it, but the one that I focus on is the what I consider to be a legal perversion of the 14th Amendment, and it's called the Incorporation Doctrine. So, if you talk to most learned lawyers today, they will tell you that one of the purposes of the 14th Amendment was to what's called incorporate the first 8 amendments of the Bill of Rights as limitations against the states as well as the federal government. Because, as many people might not be aware of, the Bill of Rights was only to be a list of limitations on the federal government. And they say, well, it's the 14th Amendment that actually made it impermissible for, a state to violate or have a national or a state church or seize firearms and things like that. And I don't believe that. And I don't think that was ever even argued to a large extent or accepted by the federal government and the federal courts until about 55 years after the 14th Amendment's ratification. So not only do I show that this is kind of a mythical idea legally, I've also argued that it's borne bad fruit because what this does is it puts federal judges in the position of essentially imposing their own policy views on localities, whereupon those localities should have had the decision to determine whether those were violations of liberty instead of the federal government. So what you have is things like the federal courts stepping in and saying that um, some aspects of the Bill of Rights are violated by having like a Christian display in a public square, but by the way, a Jewish display is perfectly fine, things like that. I show where, California several times tried to reform its welfare state, and the courts essentially told them they can't reform their own state welfare system because it's a violation of the incorporated due process clause. Things like that have really elevated the federal courts and especially the Supreme Court to a position of oligarchic authority where a very small number of federally connected lawyers are making judgments for 320 million people. It's just not the way that the founders envisioned it. So I make both a kind of empirical and historical case against that mentality. That is a book that I don't recommend first time readers necessarily get. If you want to choose between the two, get Compact of the Republic. Although I feel strongly about the 14th Amendment book, it's more of, I guess, an advanced and academic oriented material.
Now, the 14th Amendment, would these be called the Reconstruction Amendment? So you had 13A, abolish slavery. 14 was like, is that what the main name of it would be? The Reconstruction Amendment?
Yeah, it's been called that. I mean, the chief purpose of the amendment was number one, to reverse the Dred Scott decision,
Mm,
and number two, to ensure that blacks throughout the country had the most basic rights. Like, and this was enumerated in the 1866 Civil Rights Act. If you read that text as well, some of the proponents of this amendment said, well, the amendment doesn't have any other purpose than to constitutionalize the Civil Rights Act of 1866, because it says essentially that blacks have the ability to enter into contracts, serve on juries, um, call witnesses on their own behalf, such that those rights couldn't be denied to them in the various states. And now, of course, this is perverted to say, like, everyone has to have equal ability to learn German. It's been cited to give people a right for busing in some areas,
hmm
and all sorts of these things.
Yeah, it's the
Public
incorporation.
busing.
Yeah, the incorporation doctrine is fascinating because again, it's kind of this. I don't know. It's maybe not even a chink in the armor. It might be like the final nail in the coffin. I mean, who knows? But it kind of goes along with this um, the anti-Lincolnianism that I push, and people are always like, "Oh, Rebecca, you're just obsessed with the war between the states. Just get over it." And I'm like, if you don't understand that period of time, what it was really fought for, and then what came after, I just don't understand how you can even understand. Grasp the words you're living in politically, at least, and socially. So I'll go back to those two moms I was talking to. So they just knew that what they were hearing about Lincoln wasn't right, and they're smart enough. They're homeschool moms, and they just said, where can we go to learn? So I gave them some suggestions, but you know, people like us, these homeschool moms who we know things aren't right and we're just lifelong learners, we're often called anti intellectual. If we're Southern, we're hayseeds and all this kind of stuff. But, to me, it's this small remnant of people that's really, we love intellectual knowledge. We are lifelong learners. Would you say that that's mostly your audience, or are these people who just want details they already know, like the big picture? I mean, who is your audience? Is it the moms that I'm referring to, or other people?
Oh man, as far as my audience, there's such a mixture. I have people follow me that are really fanatical and zealous about American history and know all the ins and outs. And you can never know everything about American history,
hmm
but I know a lot of people that are very knowledgeable about American history. At the same time, I have a lot of people that, I have added in Facebook, that have bought my book, that have listened to my podcast, watched my videos, that are more of a layman type, but are interested in learning more, especially because it seems to conflict with what they've been told and
Yeah.
in history courses and narratives. And that's essentially what drew me into it. So um, really it is kind of multifaceted, my audience. And I'm always encouraged when I hear someone that didn't take much of interest in history to commend the work or say that they learned something new. And it really is a lot of people. And I think that homeschool parents are an audience that is, like you said, always learning. They have to be knowledgeable constantly in their field to convey that. And that is part of the audience as well.
Yeah, and you do this thing on Facebook. I don't know if you do it on your other platforms, but you do something called Today in X Year, so whatever the year happens to be. And I find these so cool. You're like a history myth buster. So you just take this thing, and people always love this day in history stuff, but you really break it down and you make it, again, not boring and not black and white, just not this tedious stuff progressives pedal. I want to talk about two you did earlier this week. So, let's see. One was from yesterday, February 9th, And it was the 160th anniversary of Jefferson Davis being elected as the provisional president of the CSA, the Confederate States of America. So, Jefferson Davis, let's just take the mainline thing, horrible slave owner, bad guy, yada, yada. But you go deeper. So, what is a fire eater? And he was not one. So, tell people what that is and why Jefferson Davis was not one.
Yeah, fire eaters were the most radical faction of Southerners that demanded secession as a result of several things. Mostly it was Lincoln's election and kind of the imposition of, increased protectionist tariffs under the what was called the Morrill Act of 1860. I think 1861. I think Buchanan signed it right before Lincoln took office. But anyways, the fire eaters really strongly pushed their Southern legislatures to both consider and accept seceding from the Union for various reasons. And really, the reasons were much more multifaceted than people think. I mean, the typical narratives is these people just wanted out of the Union because the North was going to free all the slaves and all this nonsense that even if you take Lincoln at his own word, he would have never freed the slaves. Lincoln famously said to friends that he would save what he called save the Union, which wasn't exactly the Union of the Founders that was based on voluntarism, if it meant freeing all the slaves, freeing no slave, or freeing some of the slaves and leaving others behind. But the fire eaters really pushed for secession, and those that were not part of the fire eater faction took kind of like a wait and see approach. And many of the southern states in general did the same. The mid-South states, including my own of Tennessee, also Virginia, your state, Arkansas, and North Carolina, did not go along with kind of the initial callings for secession by fire eaters in the South and kind of adopted a wait and see approach until Lincoln resupplied Fort Sumter, called up an army to invade, etc. But Jefferson Davis was not a fire eater. He was a very kind of moderate person on this question and really seemed to take a position against secession almost at all costs. And same with Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president. I actually am not that big of a fan of Jefferson Davis for a few reasons. And it's ironic that sometimes people of my ilk are called neo-Confederates because all of my work on the Confederacy is actually that I've written on Davis and Stephens in particular is pretty critical. But Davis was a reluctant statesman. He wanted to be a officer in the military and perhaps command the entire Confederate Army, but he was very popular in the South and was elected, and he accepted.
Yeah, my next question was going to be for some of the rebel remnant listening to this, some of his unpopular acts as president, which I think is not common among kind of we Southern without apology people. And then I want you to finish up telling people about a little bit about his time in jail, Jefferson Davis's time in prison, which if I think if most people knew that, they would be appalled by it.
Yeah, so Jefferson Davis, believe it or not, was fairly controversial in the South, in the CSA. Several prominent figures had big problems with some of his policies. I think the three most infamous that were controversial was, like Lincoln, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in certain places, even just like in the Union, the Confederate Constitution of 1861, which Marshall DeRosa writes a fantastic book on this, confined that power to the legislature alone and only in times of insurrections, right? So several prominent figures, including the governor of Georgia, whose name was Joseph Emerson Brown, and other prominent figures like Henry Foote, really condemned Jefferson Davis for having done this. Two other things were there was a nationalization effort in terms of finances. The Confederate government printed fiat currency, much like the North printed what was called greenbacks, not backed by hard commodities. This was, again, overreach according to the Confederate Constitution. Also, Jefferson Davis implemented a draft. This is, again, not among the enumerated powers of the Confederate Constitution. So for those three reasons in particular, I'm not a big Davis fan. But those were three things that put him under the consternation of many people. And what was tell you about his time in jail. Okay, so after Jefferson Davis was captured, and it's a big myth that he was captured in his wife's dress. That's not true. He was wearing a raincoat that was actually fairly common amongst men of his time, but rumors spread like wildfire that indeed he was caught in a dress. And in terms of Northern troops. And when word got to um, Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War of the Union at the time, he said, bring Davis before him. He comes before him and he can see that, he's still in the clothing that he was caught in. And it wasn't a wife's dress. It was just a coat, essentially. He intentionally refused to allow that to be displayed such that the myth would be dispelled. But
Wow.
he spent 2 years in very dark, disease-ridden conditions. He almost died in captivity. And in his 2 years, he actually received a note from the Pope of the time that
Yeah.
essentially said the Pope was praying for his well-being. Um, Interestingly enough, I think this will blow some people's mind, is two abolitionists, including Garrett Smith, who assisted John Brown in his raid of Harper's Ferry, helped bail Jefferson Davis out of his confines. And
Wow.
eventually the charges against them for treason were dropped. And Andrew Johnson, the president after Lincoln, issued an amnesty, giving all those charged with treason essentially amnesty. And one of the reasons why Jefferson Davis was not brought to trial, even though a lot of Northerners, especially radical Republicans, essentially wanted his head, was there is good evidence to suggest that when they discussed this issue, they thought that bringing this issue to court would serve to bring up arguments that would validate the constitutionality of secession.
Mhm.
And you can find evidence for that. Don't take my word for that. Take a look for yourself. But eventually, Davis lived out his years and wrote a very famous book, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. But thankfully, for humanitarian's sake, he didn't die in captivity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I knew part of that story, but not all of it. And, I think the aspect of not bringing him to trial, everybody's always calling, oh, Confederates, so they were traitors, treasonous. And it's like, well, okay, then why didn't they bring him to trial? Why are they kicking so and so off of Twitter? Because they just don't want to hear what he has to say. So on one hand, you know, I don't know, the whole thing with censorship in modern times. It's very, very scary, and I'll ask you next if you're having any of it. But on the other hand, it means that we are probably saying things that the evildoers don't want us talking about, which kind of makes me happy. So have you experienced any of that in your own life? Not that you're being tossed in the pokey like Jefferson Davis, but are you being censored at all, or are people just like, oh, that's just a good history guy saying his weird Southern history?
Um, well, in terms of government, no. I actually have escaped from kind of social media censorship, so to speak,
Mhm.
completely, which is a little bit astounding. I have a lot of friends that I see have been banned, 30 days, sometimes permanently on Facebook or Twitter from time to time. And but I've escaped that unscathed. And I don't exactly know why, because I've written some pretty radical things back at, secession and opposition to anti-discrimination laws and things such as that. So I don't know how I've escaped it, but I know a lot of people affected by it. And ultimately, what I think is going to happen is that all people of a certain predilection are going to be pushed and have their own social media network created, and we're all going to get into ideological silos based on our ideology rather than who we're legitimately friends with in the real world. And I think it's kind of dangerous in some
Mm.
respects. And but I think that calls for new upstart firms in the market to take place. I don't
Yeah.
know if that there's a way around it. I think that especially Google and Facebook have gone down that slippery slope, and there's really not going to be much return from that.
Yeah, it's on one hand, I would think, oh, well, they're probably just looking at you thinking, he's kind of writing just history stuff. It may be deemed controversial. It's about these racist white guys or whatever. But maybe it's more the way you package it. But yeah, I mean, history is a weapon. I mean, that's what Malcolm X is, and it's the truth. So, yeah, I think on one hand, that I do think we need these parallel institutions, these kind of alternative systems, and but I think it's just going to be all non-leftists. So on one hand, I think it's going to be really, really good because I think there's going to be a line drawn in the sand that it's going to be woke people and everybody else. I mean, the people I hear being called white supremacists who are, just, I mean, I'm not just talking like Southern people. I'm talking the obvious, just like random libertarian person who's, never even left, you never even come down below the Mason-Dixon line, this kind of thing. I think they're really painting themselves into the corner as far as, the powers that be. So we come over here, we create these systems, and then we'll all figure it out once it's done. But I'm really glad you haven't been censored yet. I have really
Yeah,
kind of,
cross your fingers.
yeah, I've kind of been safe from it too. I got banned from Facebook for 30 days, but they didn't even tell me why. I mean, who knows? And then I will tell you, I got kicked off Twitter, but they told me why, which was interesting. And it's because I said that pornographers and salon reporters should be tarred and feathered. And they said that I was abusing pornographers and salon writers. So anyway, that I'm guilty. Okay, so let's go back to you. Today in X year, we'll cover one more and then we'll get to some big picture stuff and then we'll wrap this thing up. On Monday, you were talking about how Delaware refused to ratify the 13th Amendment. Tell us some of the things there about what Delaware was being permitted to do and maybe, talks of secession within that state. I think this would surprise many people.
Sure. So the 13th Amendment, for anyone that doesn't know on face value here, is just what it did was prohibit slavery, except in the form of a punishment. So a state could still enslave someone as a form of punishment. But other than that, there can't be any slavery or indentured servitude, by the way. That was also a part of the 13th Amendment. Well, a lot of the historical narratives, especially Orthodox ones, purport that, the overall narrative of the Civil War is this was a noble crusade against the slave owning South, right? But that couldn't be more incorrect. And one of the key pieces of evidence that I cite to explain why that can't be correct is the fact that Lincoln was perfectly willing to accept slave states remaining in the Union during the entire course of the Civil War. And among them was what was called kind of the mid states, and Delaware is one. Another is Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky are the other three. So all four of those states actually permitted slavery during the course of the Civil War. And the 13th Amendment was not ratified until the late part of 1865, many months after Lincoln had been assassinated. But one of the states that would not ratify was Delaware. And indeed, Delaware was an interesting state. There was a certain political faction within the state that always kind of empathized with the Union and poised themselves against Lincoln's war and condemned it routinely. I mean, you saw this in other states, even New York. New York was there was portions of New York very opposed to Lincoln, but also in Delaware. And the famous Bayard family, who I know that Brian McClanahan talks about all the time because he did, I think, his doctoral thesis on James Bayard the Jr., I think, was a driving force in, trying to advocate for secession. Well, Georgia wanted to maintain slave rights, and they never thought this was a war to eliminate slavery. They might not have devoted troops if they thought that. And during the course of the war, the Union consistently passed resolutions, among them the Crittenden-Johnson resolution, which patently said this is not a war to liberate the slaves. So Delaware did not ratify until many years after the fact. At that point, it's essentially a symbolic gesture to say, hey, we're going to prohibit slavery now, when it doesn't matter at all. And this has happened to many amendments, so that wasn't kind of a unique thing in that aspect, but it might be interesting to some people to know that story.
Yeah, I find that very interesting, and I had learned some of that stuff from Brian McClanahan as well. But yeah, so keep up with your this day in history. I find those very cool. And so let's ask you a little bit more about you. Why do you do what you do? Why is history important to Dave?
Well, two reasons. One, for selfish reasons. I love history. It is the passion that drives me. I have a few hobbies, but history is one of the biggest ones. And it's just that I derive so much enjoyment from it because I know that my thirst for it can never be satisfied. There's always some avenue in history that I don't know about, that I learn about. And it's really inspiring to find out about how the circumstances of the past have affected the future. And I take a cyclical view of history, that there are cycles in history where, at some point liberty yields, government gains ground, and I like to study it. And the second reason is because I truly believe that better education and well-founded education and education that doesn't omit certain things that would be deemed controversial to the orthodox narratives are the key to becoming a freer society. Because I think that ultimately politics is a downstream from culture, and culture is a downstream from education. And everything starts with education. Because the state has had such a monopoly on education, um, that has led to that we shouldn't be surprised that's led people to think that the state holds all the solution to all our problems, whether it be global warming or hunger, overpopulation, taxes. It's no mistake that we think that, because that's the narrative we're always taught. I think that I really like how Tom Woods has put it before. Let's say that Walmart controlled all public education and all students went to a classroom where all the former Walmart CEOs are plastered on the wall. They say oaths to the the organization which those CEOs have represented. We shouldn't be surprised that they would leave that school thinking that Walmart holds the key to solving problems, just like we shouldn't think that about the state.
Do you think that history is uh, lacking for men in particular? So let me reword that. I've, so we have this emphasis on leftist history. Do you see it as a problem that men want to tap into history more, as you know, that they're always the problems, and if women ran things and all this kind of stuff, and especially like white men, oh, they're just all the problem. Is this something that men want to tap into history more, and there is like a feminist history or a female history, or is it just it's all being thrown out with the wash?
Oh, interesting question. Well, there is a feminist history. I mean, that different waves of feminist history are a big part of US history in many ways. Um, as far as are you asking if it's a bigger problem for men to come to grips with,
Yeah,
or?
I guess so. Yeah.
Not necessarily. Well, I will say that men seem to dominate the profession. Of course, there's exceptions, including very prominent female historians, but I don't know that it's something that affects one of the sexes more than others, though I will concede your point that a lot of the woke narratives and cultural Marxist narratives do seem to be focused on condemning what they generally call, old white men. And that's used as a pejorative. Like,
Right.
I don't see how that should be a pejorative based on, an immutable characteristic that one can't change. But
Right.
yeah, indeed, a lot of people seem to, focus on the oppression narratives and purport all sorts of things that weren't true. Like, all women were considered second class citizens back in the 1800s.
Right.
Even the ideas that women didn't have the right to vote, I've kind of disrupted those myths a few times. In the early republic, women voted in New Jersey all the way up till 1807,
Mhm.
in Massachusetts in some of that period as well. So, I mean, some of these narratives are warped, but I don't necessarily know if women or men buy into it more, you know?
Okay. Yeah, well, I have three sons, and so I'm always trying to tell them about heroes. Okay, heroes have downsides. There were human beings too, but I think that so much of modern history, not even just like the woke stuff, they're always trying to pull out the one girl who did the amazing thing, and yay, let's learn about her. But to me, that's just part of history. And just this thing of tearing down heroes, I just personally feel like it is very hard on men, and it creates this identitylessness, and that they
Yeah.
wonder, oh, they're like, oh, those white people are just so upset because we're not touting their supremacist histories anymore, and it's just, I don't know. I do see it as a problem, but I mean, I think it affects women too, because then it's maybe lifting women up to a position of, they should be on a pedestal when, men are down here. So I didn't know if you were seeing that trend. What are some of your other favorite histories besides strictly American? Do you study, European history, or, you interested in something that happened in Russia at one point? Anything else that you really like?
Oh, absolutely. So specifically, I would say 17th century English history, because it's integral to learn about that part of English history to know where the founders were coming from. They constantly referred back to that time, the English Civil Wars, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, etc. But also the Napoleonic period, very interested in that. And believe it or not, modern Asia. I'm really interested in modern China and modern Japan history. And also the last one I'll say is the Roman Republic, specifically the end of the Roman Republic, because again, this is another era that influenced the course of so much of the early founding period. And the founders viewed almost everything under the guise of Roman eyes when it came to, populism versus conservatism, Caesar's civil war, the possibilities of a usurper overthrowing kind of the merits and virtues of a republic, things like that. So I'm pretty widely versed in what I'm interested in, but antebellum American history is my primary focus.
Besides your two books, and you had mentioned The Real Lincoln, any other books, websites, thinkers, modern thinkers, old thinkers that you like newbies should tap into?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I'll try not to be too long-winded
Yeah.
about this because I could go on forever about this, but I'll give some recommendations. So in terms of American history, a few of the best books are written by Gordon Wood. Gordon Wood wrote The Creation of the American Republic, a very famous book, I believe in the 60s. Gordon Wood is my favorite American historian. He also wrote Empire of Liberty, an excellent history of the early antebellum period. Other figures and historians that I really admire are Murray Rothbard. He wrote Conceived in Liberty, an excellent history of the colonial period and early republic. Brian McClanahan's written a lot of great books about American history. Kevin Gutzman. But really, I could go on and on and on. Bernard Balin, Joseph Ellis, Douglas Southall Freeman, Don Livingston, Marshall DeRosa. There are so many great authors. But those are some that I'll point to. As far as websites, the one I'm proudest to contribute to is the 10th Amendment Center, and that's at 10thamendmentcenter.com. And really, we push forward nullification in a modern context. So we work with state legislators to push some of our legislation to resist federal edicts that are unconstitutional. But we also have in that a big role in providing education to those legislators and the public at large to kind of get behind what we do. So that's what I'm proudest about. But the Abbeville Institute as well is focused on Southern history, and I've contributed there as well. As far as I think that you wanted perhaps at one point to ask me about documentaries, I wouldn't say that there's many good American history documentaries, unfortunately, but the one miniseries I would really recommend is the John Adams HBO miniseries.
Okay.
And that's based on David McCullough's biography of John Adams. And there's a few things I think they get wrong, but overwhelmingly it depicts that period so well with great actors. And they use actually some verbatim primary source quotes from those people. And it's just phenomenal. So
That's cool. I had kind of shunned away from that whenever it came out, I don't know, years ago. I just thought, oh, HBO, it's going to be trash. So I'll check that out.
it's
Yeah,
really good, actually.
and I think media is so important. We always think, oh, YouTube, oh, blogs, those are important. But Dr. Clyde Wilson really wants people to start writing screenplays and, making films, because you think of, I've met so many people said, oh, Gods and Generals woke me up to, hey, man, the South's pretty cool. And I mean, you look at it now and it seems like radically pro-South, but I mean, it's not like over the top, pro-South. It's just a good, well-made movie with good actors. Do you have any interest in writing screenplays? What do you think is the importance? I mean, film is so important. I think of people who came to Christ after seeing Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Oh, this Jesus guy is pretty cool. And they start like running down that path. It really is something we are missing out on. Do you know anybody who does this? And again, do you want to do it?
I
Put
don't
you
want
on
to
the
do it.
spot.
I hate
Neither
to
do I.
say. And it's not because I don't think there's a place for it. It's because I don't think that my talents
Yeah,
lend itself to doing that.
it's an art
There,
form. Yeah.
it is an art form. I know there's a place for it. The one guy that I know has dabbled in that is, maybe you know him, is Mike Meharry. He also works at the 10th Amendment Center.
Okay.
He has at least started, if not completed, a draft for a screenplay on
Oh,
one of the fugitive slave incidents in the 1850s that
interesting.
culminated actually in a struggle in Wisconsin to free a guy named Joshua Glover from a prison in, I believe, Milwaukee. I could be wrong about that.
Huh.
But what he was a fugitive slave, and he was kind of apprehended at the behest of federal marshals under the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And really, his story is really interesting, and it's never really been told in depth. So I think there's a place for it. I don't think I'll be the one to bring it, but I absolutely agree
Yeah.
that everything we can do to affect the culture at large is really important beyond, just the academic and even popular histories can do.
Yeah, because my kids, we own Gods in General on, Blu-ray or whatever, and they probably watch it, I don't know, once every couple months. And every time I watch it, I see something different. And, Gettysburg came after it, and there was a third, I forget. But I mean, Gods in General, well, I love Robert Duvall. So, you
I
know,
love that movie so
oh,
much too. I saw it
it's so
opening night.
awesome.
I saw it opening night, and I actually at that point didn't know that as much as I do now about the Civil
Right.
War. But it's so awesome, and
Yeah.
it's sad, but I don't think that movie could really be made anymore,
Mm-mm.
or it definitely wouldn't get backing because it depicts Southerners as something
Yeah.
other than rabid
Right.
barbarians, and it's
They're
sad
human.
to say that, but yeah, and you're right. I mean, there's other figures that are covered, very glowingly in the North, like Winfield Scott Hancock in that movie. So I, yeah, it's a complicated issue, and it's a great movie, but I don't see too much more of that coming down the pipe as long as the ruling cathedral or the entertainment media government complex that often works in conjunction and does each
Hmm.
other so there's bidding is apparent.
Yeah. I mean, we would have to use those alternative systems, right? All right. So I'm going to ask you the surprise question. I've never done this before. And then you can tell us anything that we haven't touched on. So you have tattoos, yes?
I have
Okay.
all sorts of
All right.
tattoos.
Do you can you tell us your most radical one? And do you have any Southern tats? You got like a battle flag on there anywhere?
I have some southern flags, or it's not southern flags. I have some southern tattoos. Most radical, I do have a southern tattoo. It's of Thomas Jefferson.
Oh,
It's a portrait of
wow.
Thomas Jefferson, and I'm not even into hero worship with Jefferson so much. I do trace my political philosophy to him, but I actually have some issues with Jefferson, believe it or
Yeah.
not, especially the Embargo Act. But he'd be the one that's southern. As far as radical, I guess I have a Liberty Bell
Okay.
on my foot as well. Um,
That is sedition these days.
that is that's gonna get my skin canceled. All right, they'll
Yeah.
do a scanner. I'll walk through TSA sometimes, and my skin will get canceled. But yeah, so those two. I also have a bunch of kois. A lot is Japan inspired. I have a huge back tattoo with a figure called Guan Yu. He was a famous figure during the Three Kingdoms era, but some of it's history
Interesting.
based and some of it's not.
Oh, that's awesome. And can you tell us where your Jefferson tattoo is?
Yeah, it's on my leg. It's I have one
Wow.
leg that's devoted to liberty, so it's the liberty leg.
Oh, that is fascinating.
Sometimes I've done speeches, and it's a good opening line to say that I'm the only guy that talks constitutional history that has a tattoo of Thomas Jefferson on me. So
Yeah, that's pretty neat. Yeah, I have zero tattoos. It was the one thing that my parents said, don't ever do this or we'll disown you. I actually abided by that. I did all the other things they said they would disown me for,
I
except
was told the same.
tattoo. But because we live in the world we live in, I want to get a battle flag like right here, right across my forehead, and just see what happens. I probably won't, but that's what I want to do. All right. Anything, Dave, we haven't covered that you want to tell listeners about?
Oh, just thanks for listening. My website's at www.davebenner.com. That's a central hub where you can find my articles and every other thing that I produce. But if you want to pick up my book, pick up Compact of the Republic. It's
Okay.
at www.compactoftherepublic.com. There's also a link to that on my website. But I just wanted to thank you, Rebecca, for having me. Awesome discussion. Maybe we can do it again. And I wish you the best success with your show.
Well, thank you. Yeah, next time you have anything just really specific happening, a special book or a presentation you've done that you want to tell the world about, I would love to have you back on. Thank you. And
Oh,
I learned so much from you.
Well, thank you. I will add one last thing is currently I am working on a biography of Thomas Paine. So that's about half
Oh,
written. The first draft's about half written. So eventually there will be more in the pipeline. So I
wow.
appreciate meeting you as well. Thanks for your friendship. And yeah, I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Dave.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.